Today I'd like to discuss with you the ability to see our neighbor. When we talk about love your neighbor as yourself, first of all, you have to realize that there is a neighbor. There's somebody that exists out there. And what I'd like to see and look at together with you is our first and foremost leader. We call him Rabbeinu, Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, who was reached the highest level of prophecy. And we want to try to find and pinpoint what is the quality about Moshe. Why was he chosen? The Torah, as opposed to many of the other leaders, goes into great detail discussing how Moshe became the great leader that he was. Moshe the visionary, Moshe who could see God's face more than anybody else in the history of the world. He had the quality to be able to see. Not only to see God, but ultimately this stems from the ability to see the other, to see our neighbor. And the Torah relates to us that at the beginning of Moshe's life, we all know he grew up as a prince in the house of Pharaoh in Egypt. And the Jewish people are being oppressed. And then the Torah relates how Moshe grew up. Vayigdal Moshe vayitzei lechav. And one of the first things that Moshe did is he went out to Vayar b'sivlotam, to see what was happening to them, to see their suffering. Ultimately, he could see before. Moshe was not blind up until his maturity. But what the Torah is describing here, that Moshe grew in his maturity, Vayigdal hayeled, vayitzei lechav, he grew in his sensitivity, in his ability to see what is happening to people outside of himself, to look beyond himself. And the Torah describes not only this process about Moshe, that he was able to see his brothers and to feel their pain perhaps, and to empathize with their pain, but ultimately when God comes to Moses and he says to him, I saw the suffering of my people, and I know what Pharaoh is doing to them, and I remember what I promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Ultimately, the question is, did God really not see beforehand? Did God not know what was happening? Did he not remember? God who doesn't forget anything? Ultimately, the Torah is describing to us when it talks about God seeing. And so too when Moshe starts to see what's happening to his brothers next to him. It's not physical sight. It's not mnemonic memory, trying to remember something that was forgotten earlier. But of course it is the sensitivity. It's paying attention to. It's noticing what is going on with the person next to you. Not only being totally self-consumed with what's happening in your life. I know sometimes when we grow up, you see, especially in teenagers, they're sort of in a bubble. And they're totally self-consumed. Hopefully many of us grow out of that and are able to expand their horizons and see a little bit beyond themselves. But this sensitivity to others, to be able to see what's going on with them, is perhaps the key description of what makes Moshe our leader, what makes Moses, what created Moses and gave him the ability to be the leader of the Jewish people. But for a moment, I'd like to go back even further. Before Moses, we know that after Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and Jacob, the primary leader of the Jewish people who provided for them in Egypt was Yosef. Yosef, one of the 12 tribes, one of the 12 sons of Yaakov. Yosef was part of the family. All 12 brothers were around their father Jacob. But ultimately, there was jealousy, even hatred. They could not find a way to see eye to eye. And Yosef gets captured by the brothers. He's sold down to Egypt. And the Torah describes his descent. He gets bought by Potiphar, a prince in Egypt, an important person. But even there, Yosef is not able to succeed, and he goes and gets sold into prison. Now in prison, the Torah describes perhaps the four most important words in the whole Torah. And this is the key to the beginning of Yosef's ascent, climbing back up to power and to his success. Yosef meets there, while he's in jail, he meets two other jailbirds. He meets the Sar HaOfim and he meets the Sar HaMashkim, the wine minister and the baker of Pharaoh. And one day he says to them, Madua pneichem ra'im hayom. Why are your faces fallen today? Imagine Yosef is in the pit. That's how it's called in the Torah. The jail is called a bor. The jails in those days, I'm sure, were not like our jails. They were not watching TV all day. They didn't have internet, and they surely didn't have cell phones. Who knows if they even had 3 meals a day. Sanitation conditions, we can only imagine what that pit was. And you can only think in your minds who was there, who was in that pit, in that jail, and what their future was, what the future held in store for them. Excuse me. What could they hope for? Were they depressed? Of course they were depressed. Everybody that was in the pit was at a low point in their lives, and perhaps with no hope for the future. Yosef walks in and he sees these two ministers, and he's still able to see that perhaps something is different. Madua pneichem ra'im hayom. What do you mean, why are you depressed today? We're depressed every day. We're depressed all the time. And yet Yosef had the sensitivity, the ability to see that perhaps something was troubling them, even more than usual. Something was troubling them. And from that innocent, almost insignificant question, they of course tell him their dreams, and Yosef interprets their dreams. Ultimately, when Pharaoh needs a dream interpreter, Yosef gets called up, and Yosef becomes very quickly the viceroy of Egypt. So essentially the success, the key to the redemption starts when Yosef is able to see with sensitivity not his brothers, but even in the darkest places, he's able to notice what's happening to the person who's next to him, who's those ministers in the Egyptian bor, in the Egyptian pit. And from there, things start to get better. We see the same, going back to Moses now, we see the same sensitivity coming to play when the Torah describes who is this Moses and why is he chosen to be the ultimate rabbi, Rabbeinu, ultimate leader of the Jewish people. The Torah describes 3 episodes. The first episode, Moshe comes out, and as we said before, he sees an Egyptian hitting a Hebrew. And Moshe steps up and he protects his brother. Ultimately, he gets in trouble for this act, but he puts his life on the line, essentially, and he protects his brother. The Torah describes the second episode. Moshe goes out and he sees now not just injustice or oppression of one people from another people, but he sees 2 Jews fighting. 2 Jews fighting. Moshe says, why are you fighting? We have to stop fighting. Isn't it a shame that we should be fighting each other? The Torah goes on to describe how Moshe, after word gets out that perhaps he's killed an Egyptian, he runs away. Pharaoh wants to incarcerate him, and he runs away and reaches Midian. And in Midian, the Torah tells us a 3rd episode. Moshe reaches a foreign land in Midian, and he sees some shepherds. And they are essentially pushing aside, not treating justly, not treating fairly, the women shepherds, the daughters of Jethro, daughters of Yitro. And Moshe gets up, Vayakol Moshe vayatzilan. He sees what's going on, the injustice which is being done here, and he chases away the oppressors and he saves them. The Torah chooses to teach us 3 stories which show us that Moshe was so sensitive about injustice, about caring for what's happening to others. whether that other is your fellow Jew, whether it's a fellow Jew being oppressed by a non-Jew, or even if it's a Gentile oppressing another Gentile. Moshe had this sensitivity and this care, this ability not to stand for injustice, but to, first of all, see what is going on with the other people and to do something about it. The Midrash fills in with one more story. And as we all know, the forefathers were all shepherds. Avram had many cattle, as did Yitzchak and Yaakov. As they're described, the Torah describes when they come down to Egypt, Yosef introduces his brothers to Pharaoh by saying they are all shepherds for generations. What is special about being a shepherd? So when Moshe is shepherding his father-in-law's sheep in Midian, as we described, Moshe had to run away. Moshe has this flock of sheep, and the Midrash describes that there's one sheep, one baby lamb, which somehow gets separated from the others and gets lost and is perhaps crying out. And Moshe has a whole flock to tend to. But somehow Moshe hears the small little cry of this lamb, and he follows the lamb. And he tries to save her. He tries to protect her from the elements. Tries to perhaps release her from where she got lost. And at that precise moment, the Torah tells us of the burning bush. It's almost as if God is saying, to who am I going to reveal myself? Somebody who can hear the cries of his flock. Of course, it starts with the flock of sheep, but ultimately Moshe became the shepherd of all the Jewish people. So the first thing is to notice when somebody is in trouble, notice when somebody is in pain, notice when somebody is in distress. And it's an amazing thing. The Torah describes how that burning bush perhaps was there even before Moshe arrived. It may even be that many, many other people passed by those desert hills and they saw the bush which was burning, but they didn't really recognize it. They weren't sensitive to notice something strange is going on here. Because Moshe had this unique sensitivity and awareness of what is going on around him, he was the one to see, not only to see, but he said, let me turn from my path after saving the little lamb. Let me turn from my path and go and see what's going on. Why is this bush not burning? And ultimately, this is when God reveals himself to Moshe. And he says to Moshe, Moshe, you who have this unique sensitivity, I see that you're the one who's the right one to send to save my people in Egypt. My people in Egypt who are perhaps burning, like this little burning bush. But this is a symbol to tell you that the bush is not consumed. Although the Jewish people are going through hardship and trials, and perhaps even terrible suffering, ultimately the bush will not be consumed. And there is future for the Jewish people. And I want you, with your unique sensitivity, to go back to Egypt and release my people from bondage, to take them out of their suffering and bring them to the promised land. So if there's one thing that we can learn from the Torah's description of Moshe, is that he's following in the footsteps of perhaps something that what he learned from his forefather Yosef, and ultimately it's described as a unique sensitivity that is attributed to Hashem, to God himself. The ability not only to see and be concerned with what's going on in your life and things which are bothering you, but to be able to be aware and sensitive and have that acute sensitivity to what's happening to the other, what's happening to the people around you. Not only what's happening to them, but perhaps if they need help, to be able to go ahead and take a stand and stand up for them. But it all starts with, first of all, being aware, noticing what's happening to somebody next to you, and ultimately caring and being aware and being sensitive of the people around us. May we all develop this sensitivity like our forefather Moshe. Shalom.